Welcome. I'm Paul Carisse, Director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State University. In collaboration with ASU's Hayden Library, our school has created an archive of rare books and writings called the Civic Classics Collection. This collection addresses some of the essential ideas, leaders, and debates of American history and of our political and economic order. We carefully curated this collection as a service to our ASU students and to the Arizona community to support civic education in classrooms and in public life. Now, through this video, we're delighted to be able to share this resource more broadly, not only with our fellow Arizonans, but with fellow Americans.
The Federalist was conceived by Alexander Hamilton as a way to help get the United States Constitution ratified by the state of New York. Hamilton enlisted the cooperation of fellow New Yorker John Jay and Virginian James Madison. All three authors contributed essays, and all three signed the papers with the same pseudonym after a Roman Republican statesman, Publius. The individual essays were published in newspapers throughout the colonies. Hamilton went on to publish the first 36 Federalist essays as a book in March of 1788. A further 49 essays were published in May of 1788. The Federalist has since become an authoritative source for explaining the Constitution and a classic in the fields of political science and political philosophy. The basic pitch of the Federalist Papers is simple. The critics of the proposed Constitution have argued that it would create a massive central state consolidating power in a way that would lead to tyranny, but they are wrong. The Constitution seeks to build upon the Articles of Confederation to make a more effective government. Most of its changes correct commonly admitted problems. For example, empowering the federal government to regulate interstate commerce to stop trade wars between the states. This Constitution creates a carefully limited government that divides power. It limits the federal government only to enumerated powers, leaving most authority with the states. It also prevents any one branch of the federal government from becoming too powerful because of the government's separation of powers and checks and balances. The irony is that the authors of the Federalist sometimes had to defend features of the Constitution that they had opposed in the convention, but they recognized their responsibility was to defend the Constitution as agreed to by the convention rather than their own personal wishes of what a federal government should look like. This first edition copy of the Federalist was one of just 500 copies printed. Stride Toward Freedom is Martin Luther King Jr.'s first-hand account of one of the most important moments in the movement for African American civil rights, the Montgomery bus boycott. King helped lead the bus boycott following the arrest of Rosa Parks. In this book, we encounter Dr. King the storyteller weaving together the Montgomery story, King the orator who would spend 15 hours a week preparing his Sunday sermons, but who gave his great December 5th speech with only 20 minutes to prepare, King the organizer and administrator, and King the philosopher and theologian, who wrestled with Thoreau and Marx, Niebuhr and Nietzsche, Gandhi, and the Bible. The most famous chapter is titled Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. It asks and answers what was the intellectual journey and who were the intellectual influences which led King to his commitment to nonviolent resistance. It is here that King talks about his fascination with Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience. King explains why he found Karl Marx objectionable but challenging. King also elaborates his use of the Gandhian concept of satyagraha and the Christian concept of agape. In addition to the signed copy of Stride Toward Freedom, the Civic Classics Collection also includes a signed copy of a collection of King's sermons entitled The Strength to Love. The Seneca Falls Declaration, or Declaration of Sentiments, was the product of the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, perhaps the most important American gathering on behalf of women's rights. Although the Declaration cannot be called the simple product of a single author, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is its chief author. Stanton's biographer, Laura Curtis Bullard, has aptly called the Declaration of Sentiments a serious parody of the Declaration of Independence. Just as the Declaration of Independence insisted that all men are created equal, the Declaration of Sentiments insists that all men and women are created equal. And as the Declaration of Independence enumerated grievances on behalf of the American colonies against Great Britain, the Declaration of Sentiments enumerates grievances on behalf of womankind against mankind generally. In its own time, the Declaration of Sentiments was deeply controversial. It was not well received by the public at large and even produced disagreement among women's rights advocates. Our copy of the Seneca Falls Declaration was printed in the North Star newspaper on August 11, 1848. This newspaper was edited by former slave and prominent abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who was also one of Stanton's chief supporters at Seneca Falls. Reflecting on the women's suffrage movement in his book Life and Times, Douglass quipped, "Seeing that the male governments of the world have failed, can do no harm to try the experiment of a government by man and woman united." Adam Smith was born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland. He is regarded as the founding father of modern economics. His Wealth of Nations extols the benefits of the division of labor, competition, and trade. It famously argues that where markets are competitive, an individual pursuing his or her own self-interest is led by an invisible hand to advance the public interest. Smith was also a leading thinker in the classical liberal political tradition. He opposed special interests and advocated the expansion of economic opportunity. Smith was a key figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, alongside figures like Francis Hutchinson, David Hume, and Adam Ferguson. Like many of these other figures, Smith explored foundational questions regarding human nature and morality in his other great work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The Wealth of Nations was widely and closely read by the American founding generation. It remains a foundational text for economic thinking to the present day. George Washington's Farewell Address of 1796 is one of the crucial founding documents of our republic, and into the 20th century was widely studied by educated Americans. An extraordinary element of Washington's statesmanship is that he resigned from great power not once, but twice. He first retired in 1783 after leading American forces to defeat Britain in the Revolutionary War. He returned to public life to lead the Constitutional Convention in 1787, then was unanimously elected as first president under the new government. He wanted to retire for good at the end of his first term, but thought he owed an explanation to his fellow citizens for withdrawing from public service. He asked then Congressman James Madison to draft a farewell statement in 1792. His circle of advisors argued that the new government and federal republic was too fragile without his moderating presence, so he reluctantly allowed himself to be elected again as president. But near the end of his second term, he firmly planned to retire, so sent the Madison draft to Alexander Hamilton to be reworked. After exchanges between Washington and Hamilton, some of which were captured in the recent hit musical Hamilton, then some final contributions from John Jay, Washington made final revisions himself and had the farewell statement printed in a Philadelphia newspaper in mid-September 1796. He chose this date to commemorate the final day of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The address is a master lesson in the principles of American constitutionalism and the importance of our federal union. It emphasizes that America's citizenry must cultivate religious belief and be well educated to sustain a healthy republic. There are warnings as well about excessive partisanship, allowing foreign powers to interfere in our politics, and sectional or geographic division in America. The farewell address was widely republished in America and Europe. The Civic Classics Collection has 2 of these 1796 reprintings from a Boston newspaper and a London paper. If you study the address, you'll see grounds to doubt the widespread interpretation that it recommends American avoidance of entangling alliances, a phrase, in fact, Washington never uses. Of particular significance today is the warning against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. This advice reminds Americans of the need to maintain a vigorous but decent civic discourse and to follow Washington's example of a public-spirited commitment to the common good. Born into slavery, Frederick Douglass escaped in 1838. Once free, he became one of the champions of abolitionism in the United States. In the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, he tells the story of his life in and escape from slavery. In a passage of the narrative, Douglass brilliantly ties together 5 things: humanity, reason, truth, moral rightness, and freedom. According to Douglass, human nature is defined by the free exercise of reason in pursuit of truth, both in a logical sense, for example, detecting inconsistencies in slavery, and in a moral sense, for example, knowing that slavery is wrong. He points to a deeper level of the moral wrongness of slavery beyond forced confinement, the dehumanizing effect it has on the slave's self-perception, interrupting the process of self-knowledge that is a defining feature of human dignity. That is what W.E.B. Du Bois will later refer to as the veil that can inhibit true self-perception by Black Americans. Although the narrative was published in 1845, Douglass continued adding to his autobiography throughout his life. In 1852, he published My Bondage and My Freedom, which duplicated some material from the narrative, but also included new writing as well. Then in 1882, he published The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, with still further additions. In addition to his autobiographical writings, Douglass published an anti-slavery newspaper, was an important anti-slavery orator, and near the end of his life served as the U.S. ambassador to Haiti. The Gettysburg Address is not only one of the most famous speeches in American history, it also has one of the most interesting publication histories. President Abraham Lincoln made copies of the Gettysburg Address for various friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. These copies include the Everett copy given to Edward Everett, a noted orator of the day who had shared the stage with Lincoln at Gettysburg, the Hay and Nicolay copies, presented to each of Lincoln's 2 secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, and the Bancroft copy, given to George Bancroft, the father of American history. Interestingly, there are some differences in the text of these different copies. Most famously, some include the words "under God" and others do not. The 5th copy of the Gettysburg Address, and the last to be created, is called the Bliss copy, and it has its own particular history. During the Civil War, Alexander Bliss and John Pendleton Kennedy conceived the idea of collecting short contributions from prominent figures of the day in a volume called Autograph Leaves of Our Country's Authors. According to the Smithsonian, they intended to sell copies of the book to raise money for the U.S. Sanitary and U.S. Christian Commissions, which provided services to soldiers, set up hospitals, and raised funds for supplies. For this volume, they asked Lincoln to contribute a copy of his Gettysburg Address, and he did. Gettysburg was the location of the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. In 3 short paragraphs, Lincoln articulated a powerful understanding of the significance of the sacrifice of so many Union soldiers. Edward Everett had spoken for hours before Lincoln's address. Lincoln only needed a couple of minutes to deliver the remarks that he had prepared. Yet Everett would later write to Lincoln, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Lincoln identified the American character with the fundamental principles contained in the Declaration of Independence, those principles of liberty and equality expressed 77 years ago. He impressed upon his audience the noble calling of which they were a part, as well as the urgency of their task. If the United States failed to prove the viability of their Republican experiment, he warned, government of, by, and for the people might perish from the earth. More than 150 years later, the Gettysburg Address still stands as an authoritative expression of the high aspirations of the American people. The 6-volume History of Women's Suffrage is just what its name suggests, an attempt to provide a history of American efforts to guarantee constitutionally to women the right to vote. These efforts achieved success with the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution on August 18, 1920. Of the 4 editors of this history, 2 deserve special mention: Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. It is no stretch to say that they are the 2 most important figures in the American women's rights movement, though they aided the movement in different ways. Stanton's biographer, Laura Curtis Bullard, suggests that Stanton provided the philosophy and rhetoric of the movement, while Anthony provided skill with practical organization. Stanton and Anthony were not only colleagues, but close friends. Indeed, Stanton's appreciation for her friend is attested by some of her recorded comments on Anthony. "Never forget that if I have done anything for the women of my country, it is not I, it is Susan and I." Stanton also wrote near the end of her own biography of Anthony, "She is the most upright, courageous, self-sacrificing, magnanimous human being I have ever known." This edition of the history includes a handwritten inscription from Susan B. Anthony. The inscription is to Miss Mariana T. Folsom, a key member of the women's suffrage movement in the state of Texas, dated June 1, 1903. Zitashah, whose name means red bird, was born of a Sioux mother and a European American father in Yankton, South Dakota in 1876. Over the course of her life, she became an important advocate for the cause of American Indians. One way that Zitashah advocated for American Indians was by political activism, carried out through the Society of the American Indian, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the National Council of American Indians, and the 1928 Merriam Commission. A second way that Zitashah advocated for American Indians was through her writing. She wrote both opera and social criticism, but most notably, Old Indian Legends is a selection of stories distilled from the Sioux culture in which she partook. It includes stories such as The Badger and the Bear, which shows at once the blessing and perils of hospitality, as well as the interwoven yet complicated relationships between the animals and humans of the Great Plains. As you can see, Old Indian Legends was beautifully illustrated by the American Indian artist, Angel de Cora. Cesar Chavez was one of the most important American social reformers of the 20th century. His work is so significant he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1994. Throughout his life, Chavez worked tirelessly to promote the rights of migrant farm workers, especially through the National Farm Workers Association, which he co-founded and which later became the United Farm Workers. Chavez insisted on nonviolence in his efforts at social reform, similar to Martin Luther King Jr. In Sal Si Puedes, acclaimed author Peter Matheson tells a portion of Chavez's story based on 3 years' worth of first-hand interaction. On the meaning of the title, Stephen Roberts explained in a 1970 New York Times article, Sal si puedes, Spanish for escape if you can, is the self-mocking name that Mexican Americans call the barrio in San Jose where Cesar Chavez spent part of his childhood. The rest of those years were spent tramping the backroads and fields of California's verdant San Joaquin Valley, a member of the faceless nomadic army who pick the fruits and vegetables most Americans seem to think appear by magic in their supermarkets. What made Cesar Chavez different was that he accepted the challenge of Sal si puedes. He has tried to escape and take his people with him. In addition to this copy of Sal si puedes, the Civic Classics Collection includes a 1974 letter signed by Chavez himself.
In creating this collection, the university leadership, ASU's Hayden Library, and our school intended to make these works accessible not only to our ASU community, but to the broader public. The texts are available for viewing with groups of students, community members, in coordination with the library and with our school at just about any time during the year. If you have questions about the collection, we very much hope you'll contact us. All of the information is available through our website at the school, scetl.asu.edu/Civic Classics Collection. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy researching and exploring the collection.